My guest today is JoAnna Foyle, and we are going to be talking about the challenges that creators and small publishers face and the tactics that they can best use to position themselves. JoAnna and I first met working at Wrapped almost 20 years ago when it was in the process of getting acquired by Microsoft. And since then, she has gone on to build an incredibly successful career in digital media. She's worked in executive roles at companies like Freewheel, Adapt TV, AOL, and The Trade Desk. Relevant to this conversation, at the Trade Desk, she ran the global supply side company, including inventory partnerships and operations. She serves on the board of directors at Myriad, the leading virtual product placement company. And most recently, she was the CEO and co-founder of Wildfire, an entertainment incubator that brings Silicon Valley ownership and control to artists. JoAnna, it is so good to see you again. Thank you for joining the Yield Doctor to talk about the challenges and the creators and publishers face.
Well, it's so good to see you, first of all. Also, thank you for dating both of us, like 20 years. That's just a rude number to start off with, but it's okay. We'll go with it. And yeah, I don't know what it says that we're 20 years later still trying to help publishers figure these things out. But I guess the world around us has changed so much in 20 years. Impossible to think people could have it all figured out. So that's why we're here, right?
As we go through talking about different models in this conversation, and using different terms, there are terms like banner advertising, native advertising, subscriptions, licensing, affiliate models, lots of different ways that little companies, scrappy companies, can make money. Can we just start at the highest level and have you give an overview of the main ways that you think about how publishers, big and small, make money?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess we should maybe do full disclosure that both you and I have started dabbling into the individual creator world ourselves. So yes, we've spent a lot of our careers dealing with big and mid-sized publishers, but we're also little creators on our own right as well. So learning those lessons as well as we go along. Yeah, at a really high level, I think the first expectation to set with people, with small creators, small publishers, you have to expect to invest in the content itself, right? Before you can even think about how you're going to make money from the content, good content is an investment. And it really doesn't matter if you're big or small or mid-size or video or writing or podcasting, maybe. Content is sometimes expensive to create. It's time intensive regardless. And you want it to be valuable, right? And so small publishers arguably have it easier today in a lot of ways because these, like the devices we all have, the technology and the platforms we all have at our disposal are making it easier to edit, format, distribute that content in more robust ways than certainly we had access to however long ago. And it's only getting more robust with the AI tools that are coming out and becoming available. But you should still expect to invest a pretty good amount of time and work into content if it's going to be differentiated, still stay human, and impact people in a way that's going to make them even think about paying for that content, right? So now back to your question, how do you make money from content? So assuming your content that you've created is good enough to monetize, I think about it at the highest level in two ways. You're either monetizing the content or you're monetizing the audience that you've driven to that content, right? So monetizing the content, I think about things like subscriptions, right? You're selling access to your content. I would say for smaller and kind of individual publishers, that typically starts with a free model so that you're building that audience. And then you have to figure out a strategy to flip that over to a paid model. And we can talk a little more about that later. But subscriptions are definitely a really viable mechanism. And a lot of platforms out there today, whether your content is video-based or text-based or podcast audio-based, a lot of the platforms have some of those subscription model management built in. So it's getting easier. Another way you can monetize the content itself is licensing it. Right? So you're letting another distributor pay you to make your content available on their platform or website. I think this is most commonly available to larger, mid to larger publishers. The classic example is like a Disney licensing its content, licensing the series This Is Us and Lost and Archer to Netflix, right? Disney's decided this isn't so core to our content library that we can't get paid and make money off of it, more money than we would have if we kept it on our own platform. By licensing it to a Netflix, say. But the idea is that you are, if you're somebody that's producing, original data, as an example, right? You have finance data that's unique, or you have audience data that's unique, and you're producing content around that, to license that to another distributor could make sense for you. And the last is selling it outright, right? You might have, built enough value and audience in your content, and maybe you're not so smitten with it yourself that you need to hold on to it. But ideally, for some folks, what they're building to is an opportunity to just sell that as an asset, that library of content you've produced. One of the most famous examples was, I don't know if you listen to SmartLess. Do you listen to that podcast? No. So it's Will Arnett, Sean Hayes, and Jason Bateman just started getting together on a podcast during COVID. And the three of them are obviously hysterical, and they're really good friends in real life. And anyway, they built up the value of this podcast, and they sold it for, I think it was 300 million to Amazon. Just these, funny, inherently famous. So they had a little more going for them than you and I do, James. We got to work on the celebrity facet of it. But they sold that entire library to Amazon, right? So selling the content is another option. So that's monetizing the content itself. And then I also think people need to think about monetizing the audience, right? And the way people think of that most commonly is advertising, right? Like, people want to buy ads because ultimately they want to reach the audience that's around your content, right? They want to influence them to take an action. So selling ads so that brands can reach your audience. But the tools that are around these platforms to allow creators and small publishers to insert ads into your content have gotten much more robust over the years as well. And so whether, you're on YouTube or Instagram or other platforms, there's a lot more tools available to you to insert ads into your content. And then the last thing I'll say about monetizing audience is, I also would encourage people, and you and I, James, were just talking about this, to think about the value that you're building in terms of any data that you're collecting about your audience, right? That's what we call first party data. You need to be making sure you're doing it in a privacy compliant way, right? There's a lot of laws around privacy and how you're collecting data about people. But assuming people are opting in and you're paying attention to those privacy rules, being organized and thoughtful about how you're collecting first party data around your content will be important down the road as that audience builds. So that's not, I don't know if that's simple, but
it's simple enough for the first conversation, because now I've got tons of follow-ups. And one follow-up is, if you're a relatively small creator just starting out, and you mentioned advertising, you're right, you can go to each of the individual platforms, Instagram, YouTube, etc., and they all have their own experience for how they're going to run ads against you. How much should a creator be thinking about the ad experience as they're building their content, or should that be an afterthought of, like, I'm going to build the best content I can and worry about the advertising down the road?
My instinct is the latter, right? I really think you have to start with the content, right? You have to build something that's compelling to people, right? I mean, if you even think about your own experience as somebody who watches content or listens to content or what have you, if you don't have an affinity for that content at the beginning, an ad experience can really put you off, right? Yeah. Because you haven't bought in yet. The classic, right? We've used back to our 20 years ago at Wrapped, right? We'd use the expression of the value exchange that you have as somebody who is offering content to a consumer and what they're offering you back. Right. And so for you to offer content free to a consumer that they think is really valuable and really invested in, a consumer is going to understand that there might be ads or data you're asking for, or some other thing that you're asking them to do in exchange for free access to that content. Right. But you have to build that affinity first. They have to be into you first. You have to start dating at least before you start asking them for things.
One avenue that you didn't explicitly mention, we can call it product placement, product sponsorship, but actually directly promoting the content yourself as a creator. I'm going to assume broadly your guidance stays the same, which is you need to be genuine. You need to build the content first. And I assume you need to be upfront about the fact that it is a paid placement. A lot of podcasters have gotten themselves into trouble where they have promoted products that they haven't disclosed. Is that product placement world a little bit different than the pure advertising play?
It is a little bit different. And full disclosure, you mentioned it in my intro, but I do sit on the board of Myriad, which is a VPP, the leading VPP company. So I do know a bit about this space. It is a little bit different insofar as I think it's a different situation when you, as the person, that's representing the content or in the content, is recommending a thing or advocating for a thing explicitly. And you're not stating that you're getting paid by them to do it, right? That's where I think the disingenuousness comes in. I think in the world of virtual product placement, the scenario that you're talking about more commonly there's a set of content that you're watching, right? We're talking about video content, right? There's a set of content that you're watching, and in the background, you can dynamically insert, these companies, Myriad as an example, can dynamically insert a given product into a scene, or on a billboard behind a character, put a sign that's advertising a given product. So it's passive the way, a TV commercial is passive. Somebody's not explicitly recommending it. And the beauty of that format is that you can change it based on the audience that's watching the content, right? So you're watching an episode of Modern Family and you may see I'm going to be gender specific or whatever on this, but you may see a soccer ball sitting on the counter, and I may see a bottle of Pantene on the counter. But those are explicitly decided on based on the brands that are available to the content owner at that moment and who's watching the content itself. So it is a different consideration, and there are companies like Myriad that are helping large publishers figure out how to best use that format. There's also companies that are, helping individual creators, like Rembrandt is a company that's helping individual creators utilize that format just on kind of one-off videos like this one. So you may check it out.
You mentioned that smaller publishers and smaller creators actually have some advantages, and obviously they have an advantage in that they can be more specific in the types of content they create, the type of audience that they want to target, but they also face unique challenges that the bigger platforms don't have, whether it's cookie deprecation, privacy challenges. How do you think about the challenges that smaller publishers and creators have? And if you're prepared to go there, how should they navigate those challenges?
Sure. I think we've talked about it a little bit, right? Aggregating enough audience to be meaningful in a monetization way, I think, is thing one, right? And that's, you and I were just talking about this for our own little adventures in content creation, right? But how do you build enough audience for advertisers to care, or for a subscription to make sense, or for it to make enough revenue for you, for the content to even break even before you even think about, it being a revenue source for you. So that audience aggregation and how do you build that, I think is a challenge for sure. That can lead to another challenge that I think you and I over the years have seen a number of publishers fall into, which is that you can cede some of that control, or that sort of like decisioning around how to build an advertising business to third parties, right? So you give some of your content or some of your ad opportunities to an ad network or to some other third party that says they'll monetize that content for you. And in doing so, that can seem like a really good deal, but as you know, typically you're giving away revenue, you're typically giving away visibility and direct connection to the brands that are potentially in the mix. And you're also often losing transparency and access to that first party data we talked about you trying to build. And so I think some of those third-party opportunities to monetize content can look attractive, but can be a bit tricky. The third, as we talked about, is making content's expensive, right? It's a tough business. And I think if you're a publisher whose only business is content, right? And that doesn't necessarily even have to be a small publisher, right? I've heard companies like Disney or Paramount talk about this in the context of competing with a Google, right? Where Google or Amazon have all these other business models to fall back on and subsidize the content they're creating, versus a Disney or a Paramount where content is their primary business, right? And so it's tough for them, and it's tough for smaller companies too. And then on top of that, and then I'll stop talking about challenges because we want people to keep making content. But keeping audience is also really hard, right? So you go through all the tough work to build this audience for your content, and then the media world is so splintered. People are so fickle in their content appetites that keeping that audience is really difficult, right? You see individual creators where even if they have this amazing viral moment, 15 minutes later, people are on to the next. And if you don't capture that viral moment, okay, sure, you have one video or one podcast or one thing that has 1 million views. So what? That's in the pennies and cents of monetizing for individual creators, that doesn't add up to much. And then you're left trying to chase all those people back to your site or back to your platform. So it's kind of rife with challenges, to be honest.
I want to circle back to something you said almost in passing, and I hadn't necessarily intended to go there, but it's a major challenge, and I actually haven't talked to any other guest about, which is the free to paid model. Because getting free content out there is something that a lot of people find a path to do. And then because they've established an expectation in their audience or in their consumers that the content is free, they then struggle with how to get some proportion to move to paid content. And there are obviously different avenues. One is just to make everybody move behind some kind of paywall. One is to offer value-added services. But rather than me provide the solutions, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how to manage that migration from free to paid.
Yeah, it's a tricky one for sure. And I think we hinted on some of the answer at the beginning, right? Which is, it goes back to that value exchange, but how much do people care about being able to access your content, right? Do they have a relationship with your content? Do they have a relationship with you? Do they have a relationship with the brand you've created around it? I think you have to be willing to give them something that's worth the trade, right? So you're asking me, and your podcasts are still free, James. My little Substack I've started is still free. But I think you and I wouldn't be in the businesses we've been in if we weren't thinking about what that transition looks like, right? So whether it's incremental content that they're going to get access to because they're willing to pay for it, right? I'm thinking about just primarily, let's say you're going from a free model to convincing somebody to pay what? I don't know, $15 a month, $15 a year. I don't know, any amount of money, really. Once you're asking people to put in the credit card, that's a barrier, right? So maybe they're getting incremental content. You feel like there's a different facet of the content you're providing now that you could be offering people that people would be really jazzed about. Ideally, that's not just based on your gut. That's based on some kind of data you have around which podcast episodes are most popular, or which Substack articles are most read, or which videos are most watched, or the comments people are leaving, which kinds of things do they wish they'd see more of, right? You really need to listen to your audience to hopefully inform what thing they would want to see more of that they might be willing to pay for, right? So maybe it's incremental content. Maybe it's incremental access. Maybe you've never shown you show your face. I've never shown my face on my Substack, right? Maybe it's incremental access to me, my life, me as a human being, or a different set of content that I haven't offered before. Maybe it's first access, right? Maybe it's for the first time ever, I'm releasing this thing, and it's only my paid subscribers that get access to that thing for the first 24 hours, and then everybody else gets access to it. Maybe it's new formats. I've only written on Substack, but I'm going to start doing a podcast. It won't compete with yours, don't worry. But I'm going to start doing a podcast. And that's a new format. And so I'll keep giving the written Substack for free, but the podcast I'm going to ask people to pay for, hypothetically. Maybe there's live interaction that you offer people. Maybe there's sneak peeks. You get to read the first paragraph before anybody else does, or see the trailer before anybody else does. Maybe there's a VIP moment where they get, somebody is willing to reach out to them and ask them what kind of content they'd like to see. And they feel a little bit more, velvet rope, white glove treatment. So I think there's a lot of ways to do it, but I think you need it. All of those require time, thought, and intent, right? It's not just, I don't think it's something you just want to fling out there and be like, cool, I know you've enjoyed this for free for 6 months, but now it's going to cost you $25 a month. Like, I think you really need to think about what you're giving them in exchange.
No, I think that's right. And I'll give a little bit of commentary and use the Disney versus Google example that you just gave, but at a smaller level. I think even small creators, and actually you said previously in this discussion, create good content and worry about the advertising later. I think I would push on that, or at least give a slightly different take, that even whatever scale you're at, you need to be thinking about how does it turn into the dream of what you want it to be. So even if you're small and creating, what might advertising look like? What might a paid experience look like of a paid subscription? I haven't spoken about this, so I'll speak about it now. I don't think I have any intention of turning this into either a subscription or advertising business in terms of revenue for me, because the main value for me is, frankly, hopefully showcasing my expertise, so that when people think about a yield problem, they're like, I need James Deaker, I need the yield doctor. And so from that perspective, it takes me in a different direction in terms of the type of content I'm going to create. If I was trying to get to a paid model or even a subscription model, I would probably act differently. I might withhold some of my best content for later use in a subscription model. I might create broader content so that I could potentially get more users and more advertisers, rather than being so focused. So I do think there's something about, even when you're relatively early as a creator, you need to be focused on where do you think that this is going to go. Do you largely agree with that, or do you have a different take?
No, I do agree with that. I think both of our takes can exist in the world, right? So I think it's not just about aimlessly creating for the sake of creating. I mean, but that's fine too if that's your jam. But you're right. I think with having some intent around where things are going, so that you're building content in that way, makes sense to me. I just think it would be a mistake to architect the way you think about content around ads. I think the content has to be thing one and the ads have to be thing two, but definitely not an afterthought. I think
I
that's
100% agree with that. Let me go in a slightly different direction, because you mentioned the challenges of being a small creator. You could get something take off, hit 1 million views, and then you struggle thereafter. And I think the underlying problem is potentially for small creators, their revenue can be very volatile. Their business model could be very fragile. We saw some of that with, TikTok going down briefly. Now it's back as we record this. But if I think about the revenue swings and the position that many creators find themselves being tied to an individual platform, I should say, how should creators think about insulating themselves from those wild swings?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of hit on it, right? I think diversification is important. The challenge is that diversification of platforms and revenue models all take more time, more energy, more expertise, right? So I think really understanding, this gets back to your point a bit about advertising too, that you just made, right? Which is that understanding and having intent around which platform is right for you and why, right? Or which 2 or which 3, but not just assuming that because you're doing video, that means you belong in one place, or because I'm writing, I belong somewhere else. But really think about, for me, right? So you talked about your podcast. For me, with my Substack, the way I thought about it was I had just watched TikTok go down and seen all these stories because of my previous company, Wildfire. I was in the entertainment space. And so I was exposed to a lot of the hardship stories that creators felt around that platform going down, even for what most would consider a short amount of time. That's a livelihood for a lot of those creators, and they really felt it. And so on the heels of that, my thinking was, I want to be on a platform where I control my audience. I don't want to cede all of my distribution and all my audience to a platform like TikTok or others. I want to be able to own that audience. So anyway, really understanding what platform you're choosing and why is important. But diversification, we've talked here even today about a bunch of different revenue models, a bunch of different ways you can think about making money from the content, from the audience that's absorbing your content. I think the more of those you can deploy, the better. That, the same way you think about your own financial well-being or what have you, right? That's the way to de-risk this business, is to have revenue coming from a few different places, ideally, so that if one falls through, you're not in a tough spot. But it's not easy to do, and it's called a hustle for a reason.
As we sort of come towards the end of our time, one of the things I've been pushing my guests on is to share stories with me about some of the craziest things related to pricing or yield, or I just talked to someone about ad ops. As you think back through some of the more unusual things you've seen in our industry, what sort of is top of mind in terms of interesting or strange experiences?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to beat Naylor's chicken story. So if for those of you who haven't watched James's episode with Peter Naylor, that's worth watching for that story alone. I don't think I can top that one. And I would suggest that most stories in ad ops are crazy. So I'm eager for that one. For me, this is simple, but it really was one of those moments where my jaw was just on the floor. We were talking to, I will not name the publisher, even if you tortured me, but it was a biggie, right? Somebody you'd think that has it all together and figured out, and zillions of people and lots of revenue and what have you. And we were talking to them about content monetization, and we were talking about monetizing their library, right? So not just, and this is something you and I've talked about in the past, not just the most current hot on-air shows presently, but the full library of content they have, right? And we were talking about helping them figure out how to monetize that. And we were talking about a couple of shows that had gone, were no longer like on air. Do we still say on air? We're no longer on air on TV, airing now, but we're recent enough where everybody knew them. And we said, okay, well, these are no longer being monetized through traditional TV channels. How are you monetizing these? And they're like, well, we're not. And we're like, great. So you're really receptive to thinking about how we, either virtually put product into them or advertise in the background of the content or change up the ad load. And they were like, well, no. And we were like, well, what do you mean? What do you mean no? And they were just like, well, no, we don't want to risk changing anything yet. We really want to understand what the opportunity would be. And I'm like, okay, but the money you're making from it presently is zero. And they're like, yes. I was just like, okay, I'm like looking around the room, like, am I crazy? Like, am I the only one hearing this? So, I mean, I guess that's just a bit of a lesson in, some money is better than no money. And I think as we talk about, even in our conversation, we talked about a range of different ways that you can make money from content, whether you're an individual creator or a small publisher. Try things, right? Like, don't be so paralyzed by fear of how your audience is going to react, or fear of how the content is going to shape or what might change. Like, try some things, test into it. Doesn't have to be full bore, but to have it just sitting on the sideline making no money is definitely not the answer.
That brings to mind a former colleague of yours and mine at a company that also shall not be named. He had an idea for a $50 million business, and he's like, this is going to be an absolute winner. And we took it up the leadership chain, and they're like, we don't bother with $50 million businesses in this company. Like, again, back to your point about if you're small, you have to hustle for every last dime. If you are a very large corporation, $50 million a year might not be worth your time to invest. So
I mean, let's endeavor to build to that problem, James,
that
right?
would be a great problem. JoAnna, it has been so much fun. Where can people find you? You mentioned your Substack. Is that the best way to find you at the moment, or how should people find you online?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. That's just, I think it's JoAnna Foyle NYC. On Instagram, I'm JoAnna Jersey Girl. And my Substack is at JFoyle. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much, James. Great to see you.